You're listening to The Donor Doctor Show, where your host, James Newberry, will help you improve the health of your fundraising. Now over to James.
Hello, this is The Donor Doctor again, and I was recently reading an email from somebody who trains young aspiring copywriters, and he talked about two students that he was impressed with, and one made it and one didn't make it. And the reason why one guy did better was that he studied the masters. So now that I'm in business with my friend Stuart MacLean, I thought maybe I should read about other people that have run fundraising agencies or advertising agencies, and maybe I could learn from them. And one of the person I picked was Albert Lasker. I read a book, The Man Who Sold America. And Albert Lasker is a giant in the field. He's really probably more the father of advertising than David Ogilvy. But he did not aspire for personal recognition so much, so that's why he's probably not known. But Ad Age did the list of 100 most influential ad people of the 20th century. And not only is he's in the top 10, Albert Lasker, but 3 of the people associated with him are on that list. Now, many people on that list are like Michael Jordan and people you don't even think about advertising. So it's really like 4 of the top 50 people. And some of the other people are Johnny Kennedy, who we'll be talking about, Claude Hopkins, who we've talked about already. We had a whole session with him. And Fairfax Cohn, who is the guy one of the partners he sold the company to. Anyway, it's a great book. Let me tell you a little bit about him. His father was Morris Lasker, came to America around 1850, settled in Galveston, which was the biggest city then. His father's very successful. The young Albert, when he was like 11 years old, he's writing newspaper columns. I mean, he's a bright young man. He was a stringer for the Chicago papers. The Cubs had a farm team there, or a team in the Spring League. And they didn't want to send the reporters down, so he got some money there. He also, his big break was Eugene V. Debs came down. They had like a union convention, and he had been accused of something, and he got an interview with Eugene V. Debs by posing as a Western Union telegram boy. And he says, Mr. Debs has to sign it, and he gave him his interview. That was his big break. Now, his dream was to go to New York and become a journalist. But his dad did not think much of journalism back then, so he said he thought advertising would be close enough, and he had a relationship with Lord & Thomas, which was a big advertising firm in Chicago. So he goes up to Chicago, he does like it, and he becomes, over time, he becomes a partner, and he does real well. Now, I've come up with 13 things that led to his success that I took away from this book. There's also the Canadian NPR equivalent has a 30-minute thing on him too. It's worth listening to, and I think these are good for any like advertising or fundraising or even nonprofit. The first is he hired good people. I mentioned that he had Johnny Kennedy, Claude Hopkins, and Fairfax Cohn. So he has probably more people in that list than anybody else, and he was willing to pay them what they're worth. He paid, yes, indeed. He paid unheard of sums for a copywriter. And J. Walter Thompson, I'm sure you're familiar with that agency, came by, was so upset by this. Said, no copywriter is worth more than $3,000 a year. That's one thing he said. So, he was upset with that.
James, one of my pet peeves is the fact that when you have an employer and they think that creative is just a formula.
Or a commodity, yeah.
A commodity. And I could give you a dozen reasons why that's a bad idea. But the thing is, if you've got a creative person who really is good and who executes and comes up with some original ideas, they're making you money. It's right. Not so much that you're paying them. They're making you money. They're making your pie bigger.
Really, it's the people that are underperformers that are costing you money.
That's right.
So now nonprofits, they don't have the luxury sometimes of paying as much money, but maybe there are other ways you can compensate them. Maybe flexibility.
Work at home some days.
Right.
Yeah.
He also was one of the first to hire Bob Hope and of course the Fibber, McGee and Molly show. 39 agencies spun off from his agencies. So that gives you an idea of what an influence he had on the advertising field of the 20th century. The second thing is curiosity. He was meeting with, I think, Thomas, one of the partners, and somebody came up with a telegram, and it said, I know what advertising is. I know you don't know. I'd like to talk to you about it. And the other guy said, well, he's a crank. Don't go down. But he was curious enough to go talk to this guy, and he was John E. Kennedy. John E. Kennedy was the father of Reason Why advertising. He had done a lot of work in these patent medicines, elixirs, mostly scam stuff. But he was a talented advertiser. And you can take those skills for something like that and apply them to legitimate products. For good, yeah, exactly. What he said was advertising is salesmanship in print. And that just really struck Albert Lasker because he was a good salesman. I'll be talking about some of the things he did. So it was like a eureka moment, salesmanship in print. So Fairfax Cohen would say, advertising is what you do when you can't see somebody. That's all it is. And fundraising is kind of like that too. Fundraising letters when you can't see somebody. That's all it is.
That's why you have to answer all their questions.
Exactly.
And you have to anticipate them in a letter.
Right. The third thing is make your services difficult to replace, not a commodity. And an early example of this is they did a washing machine. And this company was going to go out of business because they were paying $200 per inquiry, which was way too much. And the ad that John E. Kennedy did, it was 47 cents per inquiry. And they all converted. So it was like over 400 times better. And regularly through his career, he was doing better, 5 times better than these other trained copywriters. Now, he had a short career. He had some issues we'll talk about later. But that shows you it's not a commodity. Some people are way better than other people.
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the problems, I think, when agencies don't do split tests. And they just give something off to one of their people, a new client off to them. And I really think there needs to be more split tests. And otherwise they just say, oh, well, it didn't work. Well, what didn't work? That particular appeal didn't work. But maybe if you did something else.
Or a different copywriter. One thing I forgot to mention when he said hire good people, he was also willing to fire underperformers. And I think that's important too. You owe that to your clients to fire the people that just aren't getting it.
I agree. I've worked at an agency where even though there was one name on the door, depending on who you were assigned to down the hall, your experience at an agency is going to be totally different than maybe the copywriter account executive next door.
I remember you saying one time that when it was assigned to somebody, that's where clients go to die. The number 4 thing I learned from him was tolerance. Now, we usually think of tolerance as like religious or racial tolerance, but I'm talking about tolerance for quirkiness of people. And for instance, John E. Kennedy, had a problem with the bottle. Some days he drank too much, couldn't come in. You have to be, if somebody's a star, you have to be able to work with them a little bit. Lasker himself suffered from depression throughout his life. When I say depression, I get a little bit, when it's real rainy. I'm not talking about that. Yeah, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about debilitating depression at times. Yeah. He was hyper. He'd go both ways. So he was tolerant of people that were, and he could get the best out of them. So he wasn't able to keep Kennedy for a long time, maybe 3 or 4 years. But they were a very productive time, and Kennedy was able to train the staff. That was key.
The question is, do they still deliver?
Exactly.
I've also, going back, I worked for somebody, it was seemingly more important for them to have you show up at 9 and leave at 5:30 every day than be any good at your job.
There's certain jobs where you want that. I mean, if you're a waiter or something, of course that would be weird hours for that. But you know what I'm saying? There's certain jobs where people have to be there. But creative isn't one of them, really.
No. In fact, I would argue that it can be a detriment because you have so many interruptions, people stopping by your door. I used to close my door and I'd still get people knocking. And then they put their head in, can I interrupt you for a moment? Well, you've already interrupted me, so why ask, you know?
The fifth he had was persistence. And a common prejudice is for people in their 20s. People think, well, you don't know much. So he made this first sales call to a difficult customer. And the guy said, well, they don't not think much of me. They sent some youngster like you. And then he gave the spiel again in German. And that got him the business. So he was often persistent. The first time they shut the door on him wasn't, he didn't give up right away. There's an interesting story. He's actually like the father of feminine napkins in this country too, feminine hygiene. That started in World War I. The nurses saw that had application, but since they couldn't advertise it because it was taboo, talking about Ladies' Home Journal wouldn't run the ad, for instance. Well, he got an interview with the guy, and he says, well, listen, if you don't think it's right, will you let your secretary read it? And if she thinks it's wrong, I'll say, I won't bother you again. And she read it and said, no, women need this. So he was like the first to advertise that. Now, initially, the problem was then some women were nervous with men, so they'd have it. So they described what it would look like, so it wouldn't say they were less embarrassed by it. But he was the first to do that. But he was persistent. Most people, when they get turned down by somebody who's like the editor of a magazine, they just give up. He says, he didn't do that. So that shows you the power of persistence. Number 6 is to stay in your lane of expertise, and he did this for the most part. Now, your line of expertise can be broader than you think. For instance, he did a lot of advertising for Warren Harding. It was successful. He had an interesting story. In 1918, he did a letter that was co-signed by Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Of course, they'd gone against each other, and they rewrote the whole thing. It doesn't just happen to you or me, is what I got from that. He played a big role in Upton Sinclair, who was a socialist, who wrote The Jungle. He was a socialist running as a Democrat in California, and he was very the first to use radio ads and things like that. So that was in his lane. But the time when he really got burned was when he was trying to get into manufacturing, because manufacturing is a whole different expertise level, and he actually harmed them at a cost of money. So staying in your lane of expertise, it could be broader than you think. But his expertise was advertising, public relations, things of that sort, and he did best when he stayed in that area. Number 7 is the strategy of preeminence. I call it name it and claim it. You're familiar with Claude Hopkins' Schlitz beer, where he described the brewery process. Back then they just said it was pure. Well, he explained the whole thing. And if you're the first to explain it, it becomes associated with you. So that was, he did that one time with Lucky Strikes. He says it would, it's smooth. Something about that. He talked about how he toasted the tobacco, which all of them did. But he was the first to talk about that, and that made it Lucky Strikes smoother, apparently. So that's an example. Number 8 is he saw market holes or opportunities. Women didn't smoke as much back then. It was considered rude or inappropriate in public, but with the 20s and the flappers, it was a big market. And Lucky Strike, they had an ad, a lucky instead of a sweet. Apparently doctors would even prescribe this for women trying to lose weight was a cigarette, which is a bad idea, obviously.
A doctor.
Yes. Pepsodent toothpaste, he was big on that. And most people did not own a toothbrush till World War I. But the doughboys, they would get a toothbrush in their kits or whatever, So it became kind of a movement, if you will. So he was big on that too. Let's talk about philanthropy. There is a Lasker Prize that is still out. He gave to a lot of Jewish causes. He gave to he was the American Society for the Control of Cancer. He renamed the American Cancer Society. And he featured cancer on the radio show Fibber, McGee, and Molly, and got $160,000 in donation in one show. At that time, talking about cancer was taboo, just like about anything related to sex was. There was a group called Birth Control Federation of America. He renamed it to Planned Parenthood, and that's obviously a better name. So it was He also gave the University of Chicago. So he had a legacy, played an important role. He was the first to offer prizes for proof of purchase. Now it seems like a stale thing now, but he was like the first to do that. He was one of the first to sponsor radio shows. I already mentioned one. In a lot of cutting edge things, he was resilient. In addition to all the depression he suffered, when his second marriage went bad, his first wife was an invalid. That was kind of difficult. He married this like Hollywood starlet, and he said, "I like this, gentlemen. Every man has the right to make one mistake in his life. I've made mine." And they had like a board meeting, and then they went up. That's how I got rid of the idea. Number 12, willing to be thought an idiot. Now, you know what I'm saying? When he would do bold things. Like one of his first ads after going to a factory, and he'd often find things by going to the factory, he came up with puff wheat and puff rice, and he said, shot from the gun. That's how they got bigger, you know what I mean? The puff rice, yeah.
Yeah, I remember as a kid growing up, the Quaker Oat commercial, and they had... what was it, that Tchaikovsky in the background, the 1812 overture, and they would be shooting the cereal out of the gun.
Exactly. Well, somebody said you're an idiot. This is the most idiotic idea. The market worked. It responded.
I still remember it after.
Yeah.
All
well, I mean, it
decades.
just shows you. I mean, but you've had experiences where you did things and people thought you're crazy. You know, when you mailed your toothbrush, for instance, it cost, you know.
Oh, I was there in my supervisor's office when the head of accounting called her from his office and looked at the prices and the cost of the appeal, and he says, "Does this really cost that?"
Anytime you're bold, anything you're trying, not all bold ideas work, by the way. I mean, but anytime you are, there are going to be naysayers, and there's a lot of conformity, and conformity is really another word for mediocrity, I think.
But it's safe.
It's safe, yeah.
And I remember being in a review once with my employer, and he was kind of getting down on me for something new that I tried. It wasn't doing very well.
Right.
And I looked at him respectfully and politely, and I said, "If you want breakthroughs like this one, that one, and this one over here," I told him what they were. I said, "You have to give me the freedom to fail."
Yeah. It's tough. A lot of people, you say conformity is safe. It really isn't in the long run, because you're going to your agency, the nonprofit you're working with, they're going to say, "Well, I think we can do better." You know what I'm saying? It's short-sighted. It won't get questioned, but it's short-sighted in a way.
Yeah, but it's kind of I understand it in the short and medium term, because that is like being the fish that swims in the middle of the school.
Right.
You're not out
Safe.
on the edge.
Right.
It's safer.
Yeah, it's safer. Yeah, I guess you're right. One of the last things that I admired about him is he didn't have to get credit by name. His name was he didn't rename it, the advertising firm Lord and Thomas after him. He was the majority owner of the Cubs. Of course, he had a long-term relationship when he was young. He was a stringer for him. And even though he was the majority owner of the Cubs, Wrigley was also on it. Of course, it was worth more to Wrigley because Wrigley gum. He's had a product he's selling. So we know, of course, Wrigley filled. And eventually he wanted to sell out. And I like this offer he made to Wrigley. He says, "Well, I'll buy you for $200 a share, or you can buy me out for $150 a share." And Wrigley balked, and he says, well, I'll buy you out for $200. He couldn't, so he ended up getting what he wanted. I mean,
right.
That logic, how could you go wrong with it? But he was also responsible for getting commissioners, having a commissioner of the baseball. Mm-hmm. If you saw that 8 Men Out movie. So he's quite an interesting career. He ended up dying was born in 1880, died in 1952. Again, he has 4 people. One of the people he sold it to was back then. I think he liquidated it for tax reasons during the war, because if he sold it, the tax rate would have been much higher. Mm-hmm. And it was Foote Conan Belding. So it's still around. I think it's changed ownership or something. But he had quite an influence in advertising. I think it's important to have people like him. As much as I appreciate a Claude Hopkins and stuff like that, I think you have to be in an environment that rewards, that appreciates copywriting. A lot of people don't. They see it as a commodity. He did a lot of brilliant things.
Yeah, if I have some pet peeves, one is having more responsibility than authority that I do. Mm-hmm. Another is that, and I'm not talking about a pat on the back, but just being treated, you tried something and it failed. Well, surely I've had far more successes for you, Mr. Employer. You can't have the other ones. Babe Ruth didn't get a home run every time he stepped up at the plate.
I have had situations where I've had people say, well, thank you for trying, though. I have heard that, but it does seem to be the minority opinion. There doesn't seem to be enough of a penalty for people not. And if I were to criticize one thing that I see, I think that nothing hurts the morale of an organization more when underperformers are kept on. In other words, where people are more likely to be let go because of quirkiness or what's perceived as insubordination, but poor performance isn't. That really does hurt the morale of a company.
I think that's true, and I also think creating an environment where people are afraid to try new things. I know of one employer who glowered around his conference room table with his creatives, and somebody had done something that he didn't think was good. They tested it, and it was wow. So he glared at the people around his conference room table after that, and he said, I hope somebody else around here proves me wrong. And said it like that, and I think it was to cover himself. He was embarrassed that he doesn't know everything. He shouldn't be.
Right. Well, anyway, the book again is The Man Who Sold America. It's the amazing story of Albert D. Lasker and the creation of the advertising century. It's written by Jeffrey Cruikshank and Arthur Schultz, who ended up being the owner of the company later. So it's definitely worth reading. I've enjoyed having you on the show a number of times. What do you think, around 6 or 7 times? I forget how many.
Somewhere around there.
Anyway, you've been
I get frequent flyer miles
this is right.
for this.
You've been a good co-host. So anyway, till next time, thank you.